I'm going to start with a question again then. Who knows what statehood is? Who knows what secession is? And who knows what recognition in terms of these two notions is? I'm looking for very simple explanations. I'm not looking for textbook definitions. What is statehood? Is it a thing I can grab? Or yeah?
I guess I would tie into the recognition of statehood. Like, I guess a statehood is having a legitimate, like, legitimately being able to exist, and then them recognizing statehood means that one country recognizes another state's ability to exist, or denies their ability to exist, or have sovereignty, which I know is
right. Let's say that statehood is a legal and political characteristic of a certain territory and its population, which makes it a sovereign equal in world politics and international law, for that matter. But I'm going to try to avoid that part as much as possible. Okay, so this is statehood and the link to recognition. And we're going to talk about that link in more detail, because I think it's a very important one, especially for the political perspective, which is much more relevant in debates than the legal one. What about secession? What's that?
Secession is when one country kind of separates from another.
One country separates from another?
For a great example would be, for instance, Palestine and Israel right now. Palestine actually only almost becoming independent on its own. Is that secession is to take kind of a territory inside of a country and making its own, gaining independency there. Right.
It's a territory and its population that secedes, not a country, because country is their goal. Country is the goal of secession, right? We need to keep that in mind, because the territories and populations that want to secede don't have the same rights and don't have the same obligations than states themselves, right? And we're going to keep that in mind throughout this lecture. Again, statehood and secession represent a conflict of two extremely important norms in international relations. What would be those two norms? One of them is a human right that is laid down in both of the international covenants, the one on political and civil rights and the one on economic, social, and cultural rights, because it pertains to all of those rights. And the other one has lots to do with sovereignty. What are these two norms? What's the first one? It's a buzzword when it comes to discussions on secession. And they're in tension, like serious tension, these two. What do peoples have? Like distinct peoples. What do they have? What's the only widely, today almost never contested, collective human right?
Citizenship?
Excuse me?
Life?
No. It's not a collective. Life is an individual right.
Equality, though.
No?
Self-determination.
Yeah, self-determination. Versus what when we talk about statehood and secession? Which norm does it conflict with? We call it the grand norm of international relations.
Sovereignty.
Sovereignty and its consequence, territorial integrity. Right?
Okay. This is a norm that makes our world democratic.
that makes every individual and the group that he or she thinks they belong to a democratic one. This norm represents justice in international relations. So we get what we think is best for us. This norm, territorial integrity, and its corollary, sovereignty, guarantees order in international relations. And justice and order are constantly at odds. When we talk about military interventions, when we talk about putting heads of state on trial before international criminal courts, and when we talk about granting people self-determination in a way that gives them their own state that becomes a sovereign equal with all other states in the international community. People have an interest in this one. States have an interest in this one. So when we talk about statehood and secession, we often talk about interests of individuals versus interests of states and the interests of the most powerful international institutions around the globe, such as, for instance, the Security Council or the United Nations in general. If we talk about a right to secession, there is no such right. International law doesn't know a right to secession. There is no international treaty that would guarantee secession, and there is no international custom reflected through the practice of states that would guarantee groups of people the right to their own state or the right to secede from an already existing existing state. In 1970, the then Secretary General of the United Nations said that the United Nations will never recognize a right to secession because that would mean the collapse of the world order as we know it. In my opinion, we still have the same world order as we did in 1970 when it comes to the rules that regulate relations between states. But we did recognize a couple of secessions since then, and not all of them were a part of the decolonization process, right? And we're going to talk about some of those examples later on in this presentation, and I also invite you to provide me with your own examples as we go along. So this is some sort of an intro. This is the theme of this lecture. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about the conditions for a certain territory and its people to become a state. We're going to talk about what happens. I'm going to ask you questions about that. What happens when these territories don't fulfill those conditions and we recognize them as a state? Is it good for the people? Is it bad for the people? Is it good for international order? Is it bad for international order? This is one thing we're going to talk about. The second thing we're going to talk about is what role recognition by other actors in the international community, either states or international organizations, plays in the creations of new states, and what kind of problems, like real life problems, we can encounter if not all of the conditions that need to be fulfilled for statehood exist. And then lastly, we're going to talk very specifically about the right to secession and when perhaps it might exist, and then whether it's a good thing that it could exist in the first place. So, has anybody ever heard about the Montevideo Convention from the year 1934? Yeah? No? Yeah? Sort of?
Heard of it.
Sort of? Do you know what it's talking about? The full name of it is the Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of States. We have two different theories on how states are created, and one of the theories, oh crap, I forgot the name. One of the theories is constitutional, which says that states need recognition to be states, and the other one is declaratory, which says that when states declare themselves, when territories with a group of people declare themselves a state, that's enough if they fulfill the so-called Montevideo criteria. This convention encompasses the 4 extremely important conditions that make a territory and its people a state. I'm talking about international law here, which basically means that this is all theory, and with good diplomacy, all of this can change through political work, right? And if you're debating about the independence of Abkhazia or South Ossetia or Palestine or Taiwan or any other territory that wants to secede from an already existing country, that might happen, perhaps not even with all the conditions fulfilled, but with some good political work that you need to debate out in a particular round. That might happen. What do we need to have a state? There are 4 conditions.
Territory, population?
Okay, let's go one by one. The first one is population. Obviously there is no state without people. But what kind of a population do you need? Can this be a...
Mononational? Mononational?
Okay, mononational?
Or you say agree, it could be binational or...
Alright. So basically that's a very political
Yes.
criterion and can be arranged within the group that wants to have their own state, right? Because it can also be different religions, different ethnicities. The only thing that they need, that they as a population want to have one single state, right? Of their own. But what is extremely important is that this population is permanent. That this is not, for instance, I'm going to pick a country now, but it's perhaps not the best example, but let's take Kosovo, for instance, right? Where the majority of the population are Albanians. They have a permanent population. But for instance, if you had the Albanian diaspora from all around the world coming in, going out, coming in, going out, you wouldn't have a permanent population, and that criteria wouldn't be satisfied. Why? Why is it important to have a permanent population?
Because it's over that population that you exert
Authority, yeah,
Okay.
obviously. There's one very strong, very supported secessionist movement in Africa that has a big problem with this criteria. Permanent population.
They are nomads.
Which one?
Sudan.
No. They did their thing. They're a UN member, they're a country.
Still pending.
No, yeah, they're pending. They're not a state. They're not a state. But they've been recognized by more UN members than Kosovo, for instance.
Maybe Congo?
No? That's a state as well.
No, they have a part of their state that's not a border.
Sahrawi.
Oh, okay.
Sahrawi.
Yeah, Western
Republic-
Sahara.
Yes,
Republic of
Sahrawi.
Western Sahara. Okay, yeah.
Western Sahara.
Which is still right now part of Morocco.
Exactly.
The problem there is that the major part of the population are nomadic tribes that move around all the time. and from time to time they're in Western Sahara, and then they move with their herds to Mauritania, and then back to the land that actually belongs to Morocco. They go to Libya a little bit. So when they did when the Polisario movement did the referenda on whether they want to have their own state, they didn't know who's eligible to vote, right? They didn't know, ooh, we have, like, obviously nomads are going to take part in this election. But which ones? The ones that just came from over there, or the ones that just came from over there, or the will of the people is not, one thing is that the will of the people is not clearly expressed whether they want to have a state or not. And consequently, you don't really know who this new state is going to have authority over, which can create serious legal gaps and can create problems for the protection of those people's rights, and can create problems for the protection of others whose rights might be violated for people that may or may not be citizens of this new country. That's why the permanent population criteria is extremely important in practical terms. The second criteria that you mentioned was a defined territory, right? I think this one's probably the most straightforward of them all, right? You need to have borders, and when you secede, if we're just talking about the creation of new states, and this is a process that's already been pretty much finished through decolonization, you didn't even have to have clearly defined borders. You could still have border disputes, like Israel still has border disputes with Syria, for instance, and you could be recognized as a state without any problem. When it comes to secession, this territory needs to be in one piece, right? You can't say, oh, we have, like, the Greeks have enormous diasporas all around the world. Like, there's a huge one in Australia, there's a huge one in the United States. Let's say that the Greeks didn't have Greece, right? And they would decide that we want our own country, but we're going to have a little bit of it over here, a little bit of it over there. No, that doesn't work for obvious practical reasons again. And this is something that nobody questions, right? This is a criteria that nobody questions. And then there are two more. What could that be? Like, these are very material, right? Population, territory. But that's not all. Obviously, a population that has a clearly expressed will that they want statehood, that they want to have their own state. But what else?
Law. Government.
But what kind of government? And this is what makes the theory of constitution very complex. It's just one word.
A state. A functional state.
Yeah, an effective one, right? An effective government. What does that mean?
But how can you have an effective government without having a state?
Western Sahara has an effective government, right?
Palestine.
Yeah. That's more about the bureaucratic organization. But it's also about the tasks it performs, right? What does an effective government have to do?
Provide the people.
Provide the people?
With their needs.
They have to protect them, right? The government has to exercise effective control over the territory it claims. Now this is a very wishy-washy idea that hasn't really been followed through as a principle in history. Because we had secessionist movements, or like we had federations that fell apart and a lot of new states were created, and they were quickly recognized by powerful countries, even though they didn't have effective governments. Obviously that creates problems as well in terms of the protection of the population, but also in terms of setting a precedent that you know, we're trying, and you know, you recognize those guys 20 years ago, so I guess you have to recognize us now. Because if something is a very strong principle in international relations and also international law, it's precedent. Like, countries will cling on to that as much as they can. Does anybody know any examples of that? Happened very close by. Who here? You're from Slovenia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, example of what?
Example of when a country, like a new country, was recognized even though it didn't have an effective government.
Kosovo.
And what consequences? Kosovo was very close to an effective government. Like, really close in 2008. Because it was controlled by the UN for 8 years at that point, right? At the beginning of the 90s, there was a horrific civil war going on in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the European Union collectively said, we're recognizing you as an independent country because we think it's going to aid the stability in the region, and well, we're gonna give you a proposal of a power sharing agreement to make your government even more effective, which was ludicrous. Like, people were slaughtering each other, a genocide took place, countless war crimes, crimes against humanity. Yet it was the political geostrategic interest and not a principled norm that actually affected statehood. The consequences of that we can see today. Bosnia and Herzegovina is obviously not a functioning country, right? It is divided. The voting takes place across very strict ethnic lines. The Muslims, the Croats, and the Serbs don't get along. And if you gave them, okay, this is just an assumption, but I think if you gave them an opportunity to each of them to have their own state, and this would be supported by the international community, they'd say, like, go for it. Because what you did in 1992 was just a huge mistake, right? So instability is something that when you don't have an effective government, it's really bad. But why is this also, if this is a condition for statehood, right? Statehood is not just something, statehood is something that Slovenia has already, right? Statehood is something that, in theory, every single member of the United Nations currently has. So what might be the problem with this?
Not all states have effective governments.
And what happens then? Well, if we were really, really principled, we'd say, you're not a state anymore, right?
So we have
But they still are states. And this gives another precedent for new secessionist movements to say, Somalia is a state. They haven't had a government for 23 years now. You know, they don't have a representative at the United Nations. Like, because they don't want to. We really want to have one, and you don't want to let us in. You know, creates new tensions, disturbs stability over and over and over again. And we have done, this is the buzzword that's being used in the last decade, is a failed state. Is a failed state. So basically every failed state that doesn't have a government that is capable of exerting control over its territory, in principle, doesn't possess the characteristics of a state anymore and isn't entitled to statehood. In theory, obviously with politics, that can be made possible, but it has serious political, security, and human rights-wise consequences. Okay, one more. So this is all about the state. This is the world. This is the state we're talking about. And all these three characteristics they're talking about this. What else do we need to talk about?
Recognition by the international community.
That's one thing, but that's, yeah, we're not there yet. We're not there yet. but it's very closely related to recognition. It's the capacity to enter in relations with other members of the international community, right? And this is not just a technical capacity. Some really strict lawyers that need a serious reality check, they think that it's enough if you have a foreign ministry. That means that you're capable of having, of conducting international relations. No, it doesn't work like that. What you need is an additional criteria, and this is what you were talking about, and that's recognition. Recognition in the sense that other countries or other agents in the international community, international organizations as well as states, anything that has to do with government, corporations and civil society, that doesn't matter. We know that Amnesty really supports Palestinian independence and Western Saharan independence. That doesn't matter. It matters what governments and agents created by governments think, right? And that if they're willing to do whatever they want with them, then they fulfill the last criteria for statehood. And this is this capacity to enter into international relations. We're going to talk about recognition a little bit later. What developed in the last, I'd say, 2-3 decades is that certain, relation, I'm just going to write relation. What developed in the last couple of decades is a fifth criteria that some people think belongs in the criteria of effective government. Others think that this issue has become so important that it's a separate criteria, and that is the capability to protect basic human and fundamental rights of its own citizens. Again, this is a very on the one hand, it's an arbitrary criterion. On the other hand, it's one that it's very difficult to fulfill, and we again come to the same problem: what happens when countries start violating their citizens' rights? Like, there's no single country in the world today that doesn't violate rights of their own citizens. So here the arbitrariness of this criteria comes in here. Where's the line? Like, what kind of violations does the country have to perpetrate in order for it to lose its statehood? Yeah.
Well, there is no one single line for each country, because in different world, in the Christian world and in Islamic worlds, there are different lines for government. Like killing women for cheating by stones is crossing the line in Western world,
All right.
not crossing right in Pakistan, for example.
All right. So this basically just reaffirms what I've said about the arbitrariness of this line. The point is, you can't draw this line. That's why this criteria can be politically abused in so many situations, right? Obviously, if we look at it from a strictly international legal position, we're going to say human rights are universal, and human rights standards with, like a reasonable margin of appreciation are applicable all around the world. Unfortunately, the reality is a little bit different, and therefore it would be very difficult to say which country still fulfills this criteria or not. Like, indigenous peoples in Canada would probably say, we don't like the way you treat us, so perhaps we might apply it to the UN that you lose statehood, or obviously I'm exaggerating, right? But it's different from the perspective of the victim, it's different from the perspective of a different human rights region, it's different from the perspective of a different state. It's not something that appeals universally. Yeah.
Yeah, we are in the topic of culture now, which I believe is very interesting. So,
Okay.
Would you say that after the Convention of Montevideo, the idea of the nation-state disappeared?
This is the number 5.
Is not.
Is not.
Is
in
not.
there. Is
But
not in
anyway,
there.
there are the culture does not appear. So
No.
after the Convention of Montevideo, the idea of nation-state, which is Occident, which is Western, a Western idea, disappeared completely. The idea that the population must have like a common culture or something.
It was never there. States tried to avoid it because when you're looking for international agreements on issues that are so sensitive as statehood, you obviously look for the lowest common denominator. And culture is never going to be there.
Yeah, but
Right.
when the idea of a state first existed,
That was in
it
1648 though.
it was linked to culture. It was linked to nation.
It was linked to a nation, yeah.
Yes,
It was linked,
yes.
wasn't even linked to a nation, it was linked to a religion. It, like the Peace of Westphalia, how to end the war between the Catholics and the Protestants, the creation of a system of sovereign nation states.
See, nobody mentions that anymore.
No, that's like every single professor of international relations or law on the first lecture would say, yes, sovereignty, grand norm, established in 1648, and then they start talking about how we live in a different world today, right? And it's also very interesting, and I'm going to brush upon that when we talk about secession. But a lot of people a lot of arguments for statehood proposed by secessionist movements are arguments based on culture. Like our culture is so distinct that we simply have to have our own state, right? This is not an argument that is supported either in history or by existing international norms in this field. So okay, these are the 5 criteria and the consequences they carry. Obviously, recognition is extremely important. Some people think that it's actually recognition that makes a state, like I said, like the constitutional theory, or the declaratory theory, that it's enough that you just say that you're a state. Obviously, that one has no support in state practice, and we can see that with examples such as Kosovo, South Ossetia, yeah, Abkhazia, even Palestine, for instance. But recognition is something that is completely political. We don't have any rules that are either written somewhere, or we don't have like a trend that we could follow throughout history that shows us when countries, like in which objective circumstances countries are willing to recognize new sovereign members into the international community. It's all about power interests, it's all about politics. Usually it's about security in the region. And like Bosnia and Herzegovina is a very good example of that. Some problems are created because we need recognition in order to create states. What happens when half of the world recognizes a certain state and the other half of the world that doesn't recognize it? Is that state like a state and a non-state at the same time, or and what kind of problems we could get with that?
Well, the UN should step in and decide.
Okay, let's talk about how recognition takes place. So one of the possibilities is a bilateral recognition, right? You say, I'm going to have my own state. I say, great, I'm going to open an embassy in your capital. We're going to have diplomatic relations. I recognize you. I don't have to write it down on paper. It's enough if I just open an embassy in your state. The other one is a multilateral one, and this one's basically the main procedure through which states are created, and that one is What's the process? You just mentioned it.
It's during the UN Assembly.
Yeah. So basically, the Security Council has to recommend to grant full membership to a new state, and then countries in the General Assembly vote on it. Bam! South Sudan, 2 years ago. 193 member states now. Explicitly, South Sudan is recognized by less states than Western Sahara or Kosovo. But because it had the support of the Security Council, and because the developing countries hold the majority in the General Assembly, and the developing countries are a lot of times in favor of secessionist movements, it went through. They made it. The other ones that don't have the support of power politics, they didn't make it. And this is a very, again, yeah.
Sorry, just to ask, like, are there countries where the bilateral option was taken, but it's still not considered to be a state according to the international norms?
So that you only had the bilateral option and not the UN.
Yeah, like, are there countries where this
No.
actually happened, where a country said, I'm going to build an embassy, but the UN said that the place where you build an embassy right now isn't a state?
The UN never expresses an opinion on that. Like the UN as an institution, in terms of bilateral recognitions, they just say like, we need to be careful, we need to preserve stability, we need to ensure security for the people that are in that territory, you know, secessionist escapades can be dangerous, we've learned that from history, but that's it.
But the general perception is that it's not a state.
It's
Yes.
not a state.
Okay.
Like today, UN membership is de facto a necessary condition for statehood. That's why, for instance, Palestine is so excited that it has become, it's not a full member of the United Nations, but it's a non-member observer state. And what they're claiming is that this is a recognition of the Palestinian statehood. You can imagine which countries voted against Palestine becoming a member. Yeah.
Because, the Palestine became a member of UNESCO.
Yeah, that was even
And,
before the General
United
Assembly.
States came up against this. They shortcutted their contributions to this organization, and it's like 20% of its year budget.
Yeah.
So, like when getting to be recognized by the state, you may face how to say contradictions from the bigger states. Like the South Ossetia is still not geopolitically recognized by not by the Russians, but by some of the powerful Western countries. Like it is recognized.
South Ossetia is recognized by 3 countries, 3 entities. Not even all of them are states. One of them is Russia, the other one's Kazakhstan, and the third one is Abkhazia. And Abkhazia is recognized by South Ossetia, Russia, and Kazakhstan. So yeah, it's, you see we have principles, we have guidelines. They're there for a reason, because we see what happens, we see the consequences of what happens if these conditions aren't fulfilled. But obviously, states come into existence, and secessionist movements are successful, even if they don't fulfill all of the criteria. But that happens because they have a sponsor, because they have a powerful country or a group of powerful countries that has an interest in this territory and its population gaining statehood, becoming a sovereign state, becoming a member of the international community. Right, and yeah, then it's a question of debate up until which point can we allow this, right? And I'm going to say a little bit about that in the end. What I want to talk about now is the last thing, and that's secession. We said that there is no right to secession. We said that the UN was, in principle, strongly against such right. Why would the UN be against such a thing? This is not just a UN position. Like, the general position of experts today is that the presumption has to be against secession. And the main reason for that would be, which one? The one here or the one here? Obviously the one here, right? Can you imagine, for instance, we have around 300 relatively serious secessionist movements in the world right now. From the ones that we all know, like South Ossetia, Abkhazia, which are relatively new, to the ones that we've known for a really, really long time, like Palestine and Western Sahara, to the ones that only a few people know, like, for instance, the secessionist pressure groups in the place where tuna comes from, in Vermont, for instance. Vermont would also like to be independent from the United States. Obviously, it's a much less serious movement than the one in Palestine. But still, there is a movement, there is a tension, and there is a will of at least a limited number of people that are claiming statehood. If we granted this right to external self-determination, right? We have internal and external self-determination. Internal one would be what? Like when you grant autonomy to people. You can have your own language, your own education, but you're still under a federal government for the most important things like finances and military security policies, whatever, right? And you have external self-determination, which is we're granting your own state, right? If we granted external self-determination to all of these movements, the UN would suddenly have 500 members. How difficult is it to reach a decision, like an important decision in the UN at the moment? Extremely difficult. Like, there are so many serious issues, from climate change to prevention of war crimes to transportation issues that can't be agreed upon because there's simply too many people that have their own position, right? There's 193 of them. Imagine if there were 500, right? There wouldn't be order. Like, international organization would become international disorganization. It would I'm sorry. It would become chaos. And that's why the presumption has to be against secession, right? But in certain circumstances, secession has been granted. And one of the recent examples, there are two contexts that we can talk about. One of them is the colonial context. You have borders that have been set by countries that were involved in colonialism. In Africa, for instance, that were Spain, Portugal, the British, the Germans, the Italians, like the Belgian, everybody wanted a peace. They drew their own borders. You probably already debated what that meant for current security situation in Africa. But the decolonization process took those borders into account when granting statehood. But not all secessionist movements, most of them today, are not based on colonial injustices. They have different arguments. Like Vermont just thinks that the government in Washington is stupid. And the Kosovo Albanians, for instance, they had a different reason. They were not in a, like Yugoslavia wasn't involved in colonialism. It was colonized, almost, you could say it was colonized by Hungary and Austria from like the 1500s onwards. But still, the most powerful countries, except Russia and China, support the Kosovo independence. Why? They support the external self-determination of people. Why? Did the people in Kosovo, who's relatively familiar with what was going on there 10 years ago? Yeah? Okay, say it.
What was going on?
Yeah, what was going on?
I mean, yeah, there's a bunch of Albanians and
Okay.
part of Serbia, and
Yeah?
they speak a different language. They're culturally
No,
different.
what
they
was
were being
what was
oppressed.
going on? What was going on there? From not just 10 years ago, from like the mid 80s up until 1999, and the U.S. was very much involved in 1999.
Yeah, like the breakup of Yugoslavia.
No, that was in 1991. Yeah.
No. I mean,
Oh,
the US or the NATO bombs.
Yeah.
the,
Yeah. Why?
Beograd. Well,
Why?
Well, because they protected Kosovo.
Okay, that's yeah. That
I mean,
it
from
is.
their point of view,
from their
what
point of view-
Serbians did to Kosovo was oppression.
Yeah, exactly. Kosovo, from when Milosevic came to power in Yugoslavia, Kosovo wasn't granted internal self-determination anymore. Milosevic said that was Serbia because it is the cradle of their culture, because all the oldest Orthodox monasteries in Serbian monasteries were in Kosovo. Therefore, they can't have that part of land. So under Tito in Yugoslavia, they were an autonomous region. Later on, literally, in a general sense, they became oppressed. They couldn't speak their own language anymore. They couldn't have their own radio stations. They were beaten up by local police forces. And later on, hit the fan when Belgrade sent security forces, paramilitary forces, war crimes against humanity, bad things, really bad things. And therefore, some people said, because all those mass atrocities took place, we should grant them external self-determination because their internal self-determination was so blatantly denied. And that's when certain territories and the people living there can get a right to external self-determination and a right to secession. And the way they named it was remedial secession, because this secession acts as a remedy for all the horrible things that the parent state did to this territory. And this is something that is becoming sort of accepted in the international community. I don't know if you remember, in 2008, the International Court of Justice was asked to give an advisory opinion on whether the Declaration of Independence by the Kosovars was in line with international legal rules. The court didn't want to say that there's a right to secession, but it did say that a blatant violation of internal self-determination leads to external self-determination. And people that analyzed this judgment over and over and over again said that this is a trend of recognizing remedial secession as something that is accepted in the current framework of international legal order. You can also say the international world order. So this is something this is the window of opportunity that we have for secessionist movements at this point in time. And do you think that this remedial secession could apply to other secessionist movements as well? Could it apply to Palestine?
To Palestine.
Yeah, obviously it could apply to Palestine. Could it apply to Western Sahara? Of course, it could apply to Western Sahara as well, right? Whenever peoples are denied the right to their own culture, the right to their own education system, I think the exact wording is also the freedom to pursue that the economic prosperity of society in their own way, whatever that means, that's very vague. Like, so if we think like you're capitalist, we want to be communist, so therefore you need to allow us to be communist. Does that mean that? We don't know. It's all up for negotiations, right? What we need to weigh is how this is going to affect the stability in the region and whether a disruption to that stability might lead to even worse violations of individuals' rights than the mere violation of their right to internal self-determination. And this is the framework in which debates on statehood and secession take place, either in politics or in international courts. The difference is that when the people from the first group speak, you understand them. When the people from the second group speak, it's like as if they're speaking Chinese, even though they're speaking English, right? Unless they train you to read that nonsense. Yeah?
But does the situation in Belgium fit into this?
No, I wouldn't say the situation in Belgium fits into this. I think that with the situation in Belgium, but this is my personal opinion, I would have a strong presumption against external self-determination and secession, right? The Walloon and the Flemish region are completely autonomous. Obviously the federal government binds them, but according to how self-determination is interpreted by international legal bodies, they don't have a reason for remedial secession, right? Okay, one more question and then we have to go, otherwise Tuna's going to kill me.
I'm just curious, like, to me this seems super problematic, obviously, right? But a lot of times this sort of oppression happens to populations in states that are not necessarily, like, located in one region, and so, I mean, I know that there's...
For example?
Like religious oppression or something. If you
like
have,
religious oppression, okay.
Yeah, sure, if you have, like, groups of religion... if you have a religious group that's being oppressed, it doesn't necessarily, like, live in one region of a state. I mean, I know there's no mechanism
but
to
we
deal
said
with that now.
then you have to look at this criteria,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Which we said that you need to have a unified territory when you talk about secessionist movements. It doesn't apply, it perhaps doesn't apply or didn't apply in the context of colonialization or the age of new discoveries. For instance, Hawaii and Alaska are not part of the United States, yet they're still the same country, right? But it applies today, it applies now, and we have reasons for it to apply, right? That's it.
No, yeah, sure. I understood that. I just seems strange. Not that that exists, but that I don't know. Never mind. It's okay.
Are you thinking about, like, for instance, the Sunni and the Shia dividing Pakistan or Afghanistan?
I mean, not
Situations like
necessarily.
that. Because they're in different regions, right? They're like, they have their own regions, but in effect they're scattered.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at that, sure.
I think maybe what you're talking about is the right to intervene into this self-determination right of a country.
Right.
Is it justified only when there is a secessionist movement, or is the outside intervention to improve the internal self-determination possible also when there is not a secessionist movement but different kind of oppression?
Right, like if we're saying that violation of internal self-determination warrants providing you external self-determination. I understand that these criteria have to exist, but it's problematic if that's the principle when violation of internal self-determination happens even when those four things don't exist, and there's not necessarily a principle to make that external self-determination. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense perfectly.
Yeah.
But that warrants perhaps intervention and remedy of the rights violated, but it doesn't warrant statehood.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Yeah. Like, for instance, when the Ontario Supreme Court had the Quebec decision, they had to make the Quebec decision, they said, like, this issue is a total black hole in international law. Like, states don't want to discuss it, obviously, because territories are involved. Yeah. And it's just going to be up to courts to decide what the rules on this are going to be. But which courts? And why should I consider the Canadian court to be a legitimate reference for my case if I'm from somewhere in the Balkans?
Right.
Right? So many unanswered questions. So many possible arguments in a debate. Thanks.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you.
Hey,